Hello everyone, and welcome back to our channel, where we bring you face to face with figures from the past and talk about their history. When most of us think of Empress Elisabeth of Austria, or Sisi as she was known, a very specific image comes to mind. We picture the beautiful, vibrant young woman from the famous Romy Schneider movies of the 1950s, a fairy tale empress full of life, who falls in love with the handsome Emperor Franz Joseph. But the reality of the woman who was assassinated on a lakeside promenade in Geneva in 1898 is shockingly different. The police report from that day describes a woman who was almost unrecognizable. She was dressed from head to toe in black, carrying a black parasol and a black fan to hide her face from the world. She was emaciated, starving herself on a diet of broth and oranges, and her face, once considered the most beautiful in Europe, was etched with a profound and unshakable sadness. This was not the fairy tale empress of the movies. So, how did this happen? How did the spirited young duchess from Bavaria, once celebrated for her beauty and vivacity, become this lonely, depressive figure, dressed in permanent mourning? The story of the real Sisi is far more complex and far more tragic than any movie could ever portray. So let's go ahead and get started. To understand the tragedy of Sisi, we have to start in a place that was about as far from the rigid Austrian court as you could possibly get. We have to go back to her childhood home, Possenhofen Castle, on the shores of Lake Starnberg in Bavaria. Sisi was born in 1837, not into the main line of Bavarian royalty, but into a quirky, free-spirited junior branch of the family. Her father was Duke Max in Bavaria, an eccentric and charming man who was more interested in playing the zither, writing poetry, and running his own amateur circus than he was in court politics. Her mother, Princess Ludovica, was the daughter of a king, but she had been married off to a man considered beneath her station. For a woman who had dreamed of a crown, it was a deep disappointment, but it meant that her children were raised with a level of freedom that was almost unheard of for 19th century royals. Possenhofen, or Posse, as the family called it, wasn't a grand palace. It was a rambling, informal country house where the children could run wild, and Sisi was the wildest of them all. She would spend her days riding her horse for hours, exploring the forests, swimming in the lake, and writing romantic, melancholy poetry. She hated her lessons and had little patience for the formalities of her rank. For a girl with a spirit like hers, this unstructured, nature-filled childhood must have felt like paradise. She was deeply attached to her father, who encouraged her love of horses and art, and she grew up believing that this was what life was supposed to be. But while Sisi was living this fairy tale of freedom, a very different world existed just a country away, the world of the Habsburgs in Vienna. The Austrian court was the most rigid and traditional in all of Europe, governed by an ancient and suffocating set of rules known as the Spanish court ceremony. Every minute of the day was scheduled, every interaction was formal, and personal freedom was a completely alien concept. It was a golden cage, ruled with an iron fist by Sisi's aunt, the formidable Archduchess Sophie. It was a world that Sisi was never meant to be a part of. In fact, all of the dynastic hopes of the family were pinned not on the wild, untamable Sisi, but on her older, quieter, and more dutiful sister, Helene. And in the summer of 1853, a plan was set in motion by their mothers that was meant to secure Helene's future and the future of the Habsburg Empire. A plan that would accidentally and tragically throw Sisi directly into the world she was least equipped to handle. The stage for this accidental tragedy was set in the idyllic spa town of Bad Ischl, the imperial family's summer retreat. In August of 1853, Princess Ludovica and her two daughters, the 18-year-old Helene and the 15-year-old Sisi, began their journey from Bavaria. The plan was simple, and it had been orchestrated for months by Ludovica and her powerful sister, Archduchess Sophie. Their sons, the 23-year-old Emperor Franz Joseph, would be formally engaged to his cousin Helene. It was a perfect dynastic match. Helene was quiet, pious, and had been groomed her entire life for this role. Sisi was just brought along as a companion, a pretty but unimportant younger sister. But from the very beginning, the trip was a disaster. The journey was plagued with delays, and to make matters worse, their carriage containing their formal gowns and jewellery was lost along the way. They arrived late, flustered, and improperly dressed. Ludovica was in a panic. Helene, who was supposed to look like a future empress, was forced to wear a simple dress. And Sisi, who was still in mourning for a recently deceased aunt, was wearing a plain, high-collared black dress. It was the worst possible first impression, or so they thought. When the young Emperor Franz Joseph entered the room to greet his relatives, he was polite and correct, just as his mother had always taught him to be. He was supposed to present his bouquet of flowers to his intended bride, Helene. But as he looked at his two cousins, his eyes slid right past the perfectly composed Helene and landed on the awkward, shy girl in the simple black dress. He saw a young woman who wasn't trying to impress him, who looked completely out of her element, and who possessed a kind of raw, untamed beauty he had never encountered in the stuffy halls of the Vienna court. For Franz Joseph, it was love at first sight, and he made absolutely no effort to hide it. For the next few days, he completely ignored the woman he was supposed to marry. At every dinner, at every walk, he sought out Sisi. He hung on her every word and made it clear to everyone that she was the one who had captured his heart. For Helene, the public humiliation must have been unbearable. She had done everything right, only to be cast aside for her wild younger sister. She reportedly spent her nights weeping, her dream turning into a nightmare. And Sisi, she was just 15. She was overwhelmed, frightened, and completely unprepared for the emperor's intense attention. She was later quoted as saying, "One does not refuse an emperor." Archduchess Sophie was furious. Her carefully constructed plan was falling apart before her eyes. She confronted her son, reminding him of his duty and of the arrangement that had been made. But for the first time in his life, the obedient Franz Joseph defied his mother. He told her plainly that it was Elisabeth he would marry, or he would not marry at all. The final decision was made at the emperor's birthday ball. In front of the entire assembled court, Franz Joseph made his way directly to Sisi, and in a gesture that broke all protocol, declared his intention to make her his empress. The family was stunned. The court was shocked. The girl who loved nothing more than riding her horse through the forest was now engaged to the most powerful monarch in Europe. It was the stuff of fairy tales. But as Sisi herself supposedly wept to her governess, "I love the emperor so much, if only he were not an emperor." Her life of freedom, the only life she had ever known and loved, was officially over. The engagement was a thunderclap that echoed across Europe. A fairy tale had seemingly come true. But for the 15-year-old Sisi, the dream very quickly began to feel like a trap. The 8 months between the engagement in August and the wedding in April were a frantic, breathless rush. She was expected to transform from a free-spirited girl who barely knew how to curtsy into the first lady of the most formal court on the continent. It was an impossible task. Immediately, the imperial machine kicked into high gear. Tutors descended on Possenhofen to give Sisi a crash course in everything she was lacking. She had to master French, the language of diplomacy, and the Viennese court. She had to study the history of her new country, a country she knew almost nothing about. And most importantly, she had to learn the suffocatingly complex rules of Habsburg etiquette. Every waking moment was scheduled. Every lesson was a reminder of how unprepared she was. The person overseeing this frantic education was, of course, her aunt and future mother-in-law, Archduchess Sophie. For a girl who had spent her life running wild in the forests, this must have been torture. Her body, once strong from riding and swimming, was now confined to corsets and heavy gowns. Even her teeth, which were considered imperfect, became a subject of intense focus and painful dental work. She was being polished and perfected like an object, a doll being prepared for display. And this feeling of being trapped, of losing herself, began to pour out in the melancholy poetry she wrote in secret. She wrote of a bird lured from its branch only to be locked in a cage. It's heartbreaking to read because she knew exactly what was happening to her. As the wedding day drew closer, her anxiety turned into a quiet, pervasive dread. She reportedly had weeping fits and was terrified of the journey to Vienna. She wasn't just leaving her home, she was leaving her entire identity behind. The day she finally departed from her beloved Possenhofen was a scene of profound sadness. She clung to her family, saying goodbye to the father who had taught her to be free, and the rambling house that had been her sanctuary. As she sailed down the Danube River towards her new life, crowds gathered on the banks to cheer for their beautiful future empress. But Sisi was inconsolable. She was sailing towards a crown, a palace, and an emperor who adored her. But all she could feel was the closing of the cage door. On April 22, 1854, Sisi arrived in Vienna to a rapturous welcome. The city was ecstatic to finally meet their beautiful young empress. Cannons fired, bells rang, and thousands of people lined the streets, desperate for a glimpse of the girl who had captured their emperor's heart. But inside the magnificent imperial carriage, the 16-year-old was reportedly pale and trembling, completely overwhelmed by the scale of it all. This wasn't a cheering crowd, it was a tidal wave of expectation. The wedding ceremony itself, held 2 days later in the Augustinian church, was one of the most opulent events the Habsburg court had ever staged. Sisi was a vision in a gown heavy with gold and silver embroidery, her hair studded with diamonds. But the ceremony was long, lasting for hours, and conducted with all the solemn, rigid formality of the Habsburg tradition. For Sisi, who was already exhausted and terrified, it must have been a grueling physical and emotional ordeal. She was so drained that she reportedly wept throughout the entire service. But it was during the procession back to the Hofburg Palace that the first, very public crack in the fairy tale appeared. As the spectacular glass carriage, drawn by 8 white horses, made its way through the cheering crowds, there was a sudden, loud crack. One of the carriage wheels had broken. The procession ground to a halt as frantic repairs were made, leaving the newly married couple stranded in the middle of the city. For the deeply superstitious people of Vienna, this was not just an unfortunate accident. It was a terrible omen. A broken wheel on the wedding day could only mean one thing. The marriage itself was doomed to be an unhappy one. It was a dark premonition for a union that was supposed to be a fairy tale. The fairy tale wedding, with its cheering crowds and diamond-studded gown, was over. And when Sisi woke up the next morning as the Empress of Austria, the true nature of her new life began to sink in. The Hofburg Palace wasn't a home, like her beloved Posse had been. It was a vast, bureaucratic labyrinth, a machine that ran not on love or family, but on an ancient and suffocating set of rules known simply as protocol. And on her very first morning as Empress, that machine came for her. In her private life at Possenhofen, Sisi was used to waking when she pleased, to dressing herself, to having moments of quiet solitude. But in the Hofburg, her bedroom was not her own. A procession of ladies-in-waiting, whom she barely knew, entered her chambers without knocking, to begin the formal ritualized process of waking and dressing the Empress. There was no privacy. There was no personal space. Every intimate moment was now a public, state-sanctioned event. For a 16-year-old girl, on the morning after her wedding, this must have been a profound and terrifying shock. It's hard to even imagine the sense of violation she must have felt. This wasn't just a lack of privacy, it was the complete stripping away of her personhood. From that moment on, her life was no longer her own. What she ate, what she wore, when she could walk in the gardens, and who she could speak to, every single detail was now dictated by the rigid court schedule. Even her husband, the emperor, was a prisoner of this same system. His days were a relentless series of meetings and state duties, leaving his young bride utterly alone in this cold, formal world. And the chief architect and enforcer of this system was her own aunt, Archduchess Sophie. Sophie saw it as her solemn duty to break Sisi's free spirit and mold her into a proper, obedient Habsburg empress. The girl who had charmed her son was now a problem to be managed, a wild creature to be tamed. The broken wheel on her wedding day had been more than just a superstition. It was a prophecy of a life that was about to be broken on the wheels of the Habsburg court. And at the heart of this cold, rigid system was one person, Archduchess Sophie. In the eyes of the court, Sophie was often called the only man in the Hofburg. She was intelligent, disciplined, and utterly devoted to the preservation of the Habsburg dynasty. And she saw Sisi's independent spirit not just as childish or improper, but as a genuine threat to the stability of the monarchy. She believed it was her sacred duty to crush that spirit and forge Sisi into a perfect, compliant empress, no matter the cost. Her primary weapon in this campaign was the ancient and suffocating code of conduct known as the Spanish court etiquette. This wasn't just a set of rules. It was a system of total control. It dictated everything, from which gloves Sisi was allowed to wear, to how many times she was permitted to curtsy. Her days were scheduled down to the minute, and she was never, ever left alone. Sophie had handpicked Sisi's ladies-in-waiting, not to be her friends, but to be her guards and Sophie's spies. They reported on everything, what she ate, what she said, and even the books she tried to read. For Sisi, who had grown up with almost total freedom, this was a special kind of hell. Every natural impulse she had was now a violation of protocol. Her love of riding was deemed unladylike. Her poetry was seen as sentimental nonsense. Her shyness in public was criticized as a failure to perform her duties. She was constantly being corrected, scolded, and humiliated, often in front of the entire court. It's hard to imagine the profound isolation she must have felt, being surrounded by people but having no one to talk to, constantly watched but never truly seen. And her husband, the man who had defied his mother to marry her, was of little help. Franz Joseph adored his wife, but he was a product of the very system that was destroying her. He had been raised by Sophie to put duty above all else, and he simply didn't understand Sisi's need for personal freedom. When Sisi would plead with him, he would often just tell her to be patient and try to get along with his mother. He couldn't see that he was asking her to surrender her very soul. The battle for control of the Empress had begun. It was a silent, gilded war fought in the corridors of the Hofburg, a clash between the iron will of the old guard and the fragile spirit of a girl who just wanted to be free. And in this war, Sisi was completely outmatched. But in the cold, lonely halls of the Hofburg, a new hope finally appeared for Sisi. Less than a year after her wedding, in March of 1855, the 17-year-old Empress gave birth to her first child, a daughter. For Sisi, who was isolated and miserable, the baby must have felt like a lifeline. Here was someone she could love unconditionally, a piece of her old, free self in this gilded cage. In a gesture meant to appease her mother-in-law, she named the baby Sophie. But Archduchess Sophie had no intention of being appeased, and she certainly had no intention of letting a silly, childish girl like Sisi raise a Habsburg archduchess. In her eyes, Sisi was completely unfit for motherhood. Immediately after the birth, Sophie took complete control. She declared that the nursery would be established in her own wing of the palace, far away from Sisi's apartments. The new mother was only allowed to visit her own baby at designated times, and always under Sophie's watchful eye. The cruelty of this is hard to overstate. The one source of love and personal connection Sisi might have had was stolen from her. She was the Empress, the mother of the heir, but she was treated like an incubator, a vessel whose job was done. When she tried to protest to Franz Joseph, he once again sided with his mother, believing she knew what was best. A little over a year later, in July of 1856, Sisi gave birth to a second daughter, Gisela. Any hope that this second child might change things was instantly crushed. Just as before, the baby was immediately whisked away to Sophie's nursery. Sisi was now a mother of two, but only in name. She had been completely and utterly stripped of her maternal role. The war for control of the Empress was one thing, but this was a war for her children. And it was a war that Sophie had decisively won, leaving Sisi with nothing but an empty nursery and a broken heart. The loss of her children to her mother-in-law's control left Sisi utterly devastated. But as the months turned into years, that raw grief began to harden into a quiet, steely resolve. She was the Empress, and these were her daughters. She was not going to let Sophie erase her from their lives completely. And in 1857, she finally saw her chance. Franz Joseph and Sisi were scheduled to make a major state visit to Hungary, a kingdom within their empire that was restless and in need of royal attention. This was the moment Sisi had been waiting for. She went to her husband and laid down an ultimatum. She would go to Hungary and she would perform her duties, but she would not go without her children. For the first time, Sisi was not pleading or weeping. She was demanding. We don't know what the argument was like, but we know that Archduchess Sophie was furious, arguing that the children were too young and the journey too dangerous. But this time, miraculously, Franz Joseph sided with his wife. The trip to Hungary must have felt like a dream come true for Sisi. The Hungarian people, who chafed under Austrian rule, were instantly captivated by their beautiful, free-spirited Empress. They adored her, and she felt a deep and immediate connection to them and their independent spirit. For the first time, she was celebrated not just as an accessory to the emperor, but as a person in her own right. And best of all, she had her daughters with her. She could finally be a mother, away from the prying eyes of the Vienna court. It was a rare and precious victory. But then, the fairy tale turned into a nightmare. During their stay in Budapest, both of the young girls fell ill with a fever and severe diarrhea. Panic set in. The doctors were called, but they were powerless. While the younger Gisela slowly began to recover, the 2-year-old Sophie only got worse. On May 29, 1857, after 11 hours of convulsions, her firstborn child died in her arms. The tragedy was absolute, and for Sisi, the sense of guilt was all-consuming. In her mind, this was entirely her fault. She had defied her mother-in-law, she had insisted on taking the children on this dangerous trip, and now her daughter was dead. It confirmed her deepest, darkest fear, that she was unfit, that she was cursed, and that she brought nothing but misfortune to the people she loved. Archduchess Sophie had been right all along. Sisi plunged into a deep depression, locking herself away for days and refusing to see anyone. The vibrant, defiant young woman who had fought for her children was gone. In her place was a ghost, haunted by the belief that she was a walking angel of death. The death of her daughter broke something inside of Sisi. The guilt was a poison, and it confirmed her deepest fear, that she was a curse on those she loved. But the Habsburg court was a machine, and it had no time for a mother's grief. The empire still lacked its most crucial component. It needed a male heir. The pressure on Sisi, now more isolated and fragile than ever, was immense. Her one remaining duty, the sole purpose of her existence as Empress, was to produce a son. And on August 21st, 1858, just over a year after the death of little Sophie, she did. The birth of Crown Prince Rudolf was met with a 101-gun salute and wild celebrations across Vienna. The dynasty was secure. But for Sisi, the birth of her son must have been an experience of pure terror. She had brought a child into the world, only to watch her die. How could she dare to love this new baby? It must have felt like she was just inviting tragedy to strike again. She became distant, almost paralyzed by fear, unable to form the bond that she so desperately craved. Archduchess Sophie, however, saw things very differently. The dynasty now had its heir, and she would not allow the unstable and childish Empress to have any part in his upbringing. This was not just a baby. This was the future emperor, and he needed to be forged, not coddled. From the very beginning, a plan was put in place for Rudolf that was even more cruel than the one enacted on his sisters. He would not just be raised in a separate nursery. He would be raised as a soldier. When he was still just a toddler, Rudolf was handed over to the care of a general, a man who believed that the only way to raise a future emperor was through brutal discipline. The boy was subjected to a harsh military regimen designed to harden him. He was woken in the middle of the night with pistol shots, forced to stand at attention in the freezing cold, and subjected to ice water baths. It was a systematic program of abuse designed to break his will and erase any trace of his mother's sensitive, artistic nature. Sisi was horrified. She saw her son, a small, sensitive boy, being systematically tortured, but she was powerless to stop it. After the death of Sophie, she had lost all credibility as a mother. Her protests were dismissed as hysterical nonsense. And Franz Joseph, who had undergone a similar military education himself, saw nothing wrong with it. He believed it was necessary to make his son strong. Sisi had fulfilled her duty. She had given the empire its heir, and in doing so, she had lost him forever. The loss of her son to this brutal system, on top of everything else she had endured, was the final, unbearable blow. The vibrant, defiant girl who had once fought for her children was now completely broken, and her body began to fail her in a way that was impossible for the court to ignore. She stopped eating, growing terrifyingly thin. A constant hacking cough racked her body, and she was often too weak to even get out of bed. The court physicians were summoned. After weeks of hushed consultations and examinations, their diagnosis was grim. The Empress was suffering from a severe lung ailment. In the 19th century, this was often a death sentence. The unspoken fear that hung in the air was tuberculosis. For Sisi, who was trapped in a life that was slowly killing her spirit, this physical collapse must have felt like a strange kind of release. It was as if her body was finally screaming what her voice no longer could. The doctors prescribed the only treatment they could think of: a complete change of scenery. She needed to escape the damp, cold climate of Vienna and travel to a place with warm, healing air. The destination they chose was the remote Portuguese island of Madeira, far out in the Atlantic Ocean. And so, in the winter of 1860, Empress Elisabeth left Vienna. She left behind her duties, her husband, and her 2 surviving children. For an empress to abandon the court for her health was a radical act, but no one, not even Archduchess Sophie, could argue with a death sentence from a doctor. For Sisi, it was an escape she had been dreaming of for years, finally made legitimate by the very real collapse of her health. A strange thing happened when Sisi arrived in Madeira. Away from the cold Vienna air, and more importantly, away from the suffocating presence of the court and her mother-in-law, her health began to dramatically improve. The cough vanished. The colour returned to her cheeks. She started eating again. It was almost as if the disease wasn't in her lungs, but in the palace itself. She had discovered a powerful new weapon. Illness had become her only means of escape. From this point on, whenever the pressures of her life became too much to bear, a convenient and serious ailment would strike, requiring her to travel for her health. It was a pattern that would come to define the rest of her life, turning her into the wandering empress. Sisi had learned that if she couldn't be free in her life, she could at least be free in her sickness. After 6 months of recovery in Madeira, Sisi was finally forced to return to Vienna in 1861. She was healthy, her cough was gone, and she had even gained some weight. For a brief moment, it might have seemed like the crisis was over, that the Empress had been returned to the empire, whole and healed. But the cure, it turned out, was not the warm sea air. The cure was distance. Almost as soon as she stepped back inside the cold stone walls of the Hofburg, the illness returned. The hacking cough that had vanished in Madeira was back with a vengeance. Her appetite disappeared, and the suffocating feeling of being watched, of being trapped, settled back over her like a shroud. The palace, with its rigid schedules and the ever-present judgment of her mother-in-law, was a cage, and her body was once again refusing to live in it. The pattern was now impossible for anyone to deny. Away from the court, Sisi thrived. In Vienna, she withered. It was a devastatingly simple equation. The palace was poison. For Franz Joseph, it must have been a heartbreaking and confusing reality. He loved his wife, but the very world he represented, the life he was offering her, was what was making her sick. And for Sisi, it was a terrible truth. Her life in Vienna was unlivable. But this truth also came with a grim kind of power. Her illness was now a proven, undeniable fact, and it was her only way out. The court physicians were summoned again, and their verdict was swift. The Empress's delicate lungs simply could not tolerate the Viennese climate. She had to leave immediately. This time, the destination was the Greek island of Corfu, a place whose beauty and connection to classical antiquity would capture her heart and become another sanctuary. The wandering Empress was born. But while Sisi was wandering Europe, using her fragility as a shield, something inside her was beginning to change. Her travels weren't just about escaping Vienna anymore. They were becoming a search for a place where she could actually belong. And she found that place in a country that had brought her both her greatest public triumph and her most private, devastating tragedy. She found it in Hungary. Unlike the cold, rigid Austrians, who only saw her as a failed empress, the Hungarian people had always adored Sisi. They saw in her a reflection of their own independent, rebellious spirit. And Sisi, in turn, fell deeply in love with them. This wasn't just a passing fancy. She threw herself into their culture with a passion she hadn't shown for anything in years. She learned to speak Hungarian fluently, a notoriously difficult language that not even her husband, the emperor, had bothered to master. She surrounded herself with Hungarian ladies-in-waiting and cultivated deep friendships with influential Hungarian aristocrats, most notably the charismatic Count Gyula Andrássy. For years, this was her private world, her personal rebellion. But then, in 1866, the political world of the empire was shattered. Austria suffered a humiliating defeat in a war against Prussia. The empire was weak, its finances were in ruins, and Franz Joseph was desperate to hold his fractured territories together. The Hungarians, sensing their moment, began to agitate for more autonomy. And this was Sisi's chance. She saw that her personal passion could become her political purpose. She went to her husband, the man who still adored her despite everything, and she became the most passionate and effective advocate for the Hungarian cause. She used all of her charm, her intelligence, and her undeniable influence over Franz Joseph to push him towards a compromise. For the first time, she wasn't just fighting for her own freedom. She was fighting for the freedom of a nation she had come to call her own. And it worked. In 1867, Franz Joseph agreed to the historic Austro-Hungarian Compromise. The empire was officially restructured into a dual monarchy. Hungary was granted its own constitution and parliament, and in return, the Hungarians pledged their loyalty to the Habsburg throne. It was a political masterstroke that saved the empire from collapse. And for Sisi, it was the greatest victory of her life. On June 8, 1867, in a lavish ceremony in Budapest, Franz Joseph and Elisabeth were crowned King and Queen of Hungary. For Sisi, it must have felt like a miracle. This wasn't the terrifying forced coronation of her wedding day. This was a crown she had helped to win, in a country that she loved, surrounded by people who loved her back. She had found her voice. She had found her purpose. For a brief, shining moment, the fairy tale seemed to have finally come true. And so, on June 8, 1867, the city of Budapest was transformed. This was not the cold, formal spectacle of Sisi's wedding day in Vienna. This was a city erupting with genuine, heartfelt joy. The Hungarian people, who had fought for their autonomy for so long, saw Sisi as their champion, their beautiful fairy queen, who had given them back their voice. The streets were filled not with silent, obedient crowds, but with cheering, celebrating Hungarians who truly loved their new queen. The coronation ceremony itself was a magnificent affair, held in the historic Matthias Church. Sisi was breathtaking in a custom-made Hungarian-style gown, and as the ancient crown of St. Stephen was placed on her head, she was not the trembling, terrified girl who had wept through her wedding. She was a confident, poised woman of 29, a queen who had earned this moment through her own political will and personal passion. Franz Joseph was crowned king beside her, but for everyone watching, this day belonged to Elisabeth. For Sisi, this must have felt like a redemption. This wasn't a crown being forced upon her. It was a crown she had actively fought for. It wasn't a symbol of her confinement, but of her liberation. Here, in this country that mirrored her own rebellious spirit, her love of freedom was not a flaw to be corrected, but a virtue to be celebrated. For the first time, her personal desires and her political duties were not in conflict. They were one and the same. She had finally found her home. This was the absolute apex of her life. She had a purpose that she believed in, the love of a nation, and a political victory that had reshaped an empire. For this one perfect day, the lonely, wandering Empress was gone. In her place stood a queen, beloved and at home, finally at peace with her crown. The coronation in Hungary was more than just a political victory for Sisi. It was a personal one. For the first time, she had proven her worth not just as a beautiful accessory, but as a vital political force. She had saved her husband's empire, and in doing so, she had gained a level of confidence and leverage that she had never possessed before, and she decided to use it. Armed with the love of a nation and the undeniable proof of her own competence, Sisi returned to her husband and delivered an ultimatum. This wasn't the pleading, terrified girl of her youth. This was the Queen of Hungary. She demanded complete and total control over her own life. She would decide where she travelled, when she travelled, and who she saw. But most importantly, she laid down one non-negotiable condition. If she were to have another child, that child would be hers and hers alone. There would be no interference from Archduchess Sophie, no separate nursery, no stolen moments of motherhood. Faced with a confident, resolute wife who had just secured the future of his monarchy, Franz Joseph finally and completely gave in. He chose Elisabeth. The reign of Archduchess Sophie was over. And just 10 months later, in April of 1868, the fruits of this victory became clear. In Budapest, in her beloved Hungary, Sisi gave birth to her fourth child, a daughter named Marie Valerie. This time, everything was different. There was no nursery in a separate wing of the palace. The baby was not whisked away by ladies-in-waiting. Valerie stayed with her mother. For Sisi, it must have felt like a miracle, a healing of the deepest wound in her soul. She was finally allowed to be a mother. She poured all of the frustrated, heartbroken maternal love she had been forced to suppress for her other children into this one baby. She doted on Valerie, dressed her in Hungarian clothes, and spoke to her only in Hungarian. In the eyes of the court and in Sisi's own heart, Valerie became known as the only child. She had won the war for her own freedom, and the prize was her daughter. It was the ultimate personal triumph, a quiet domestic victory that in many ways meant more to her than the crown of Hungary itself. But the peace Sisi found in Hungary, this golden age of purpose and motherhood, was tragically short-lived. The political crisis that had given her a role to play was over. The empire was stable. And while she adored her daughter Valerie, motherhood alone could not fill the endless empty hours of a life that still felt fundamentally useless. The old feelings of restlessness and melancholy began to creep back in. She had tasted real power, the power to influence nations. But she must have realized that this was a rare exception, a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. At the end of the day, her day-to-day freedom, her ability to escape Vienna, her leverage over her husband, it all still stemmed from one single, terrifyingly fragile source: Franz Joseph's adoration of her. An adoration that had been sparked in an instant, based on one thing: her beauty. For a woman now entering her 30s, this must have been a moment of pure panic. In a world where a woman's value and influence were so tied to her youth, the first wrinkle or grey hair wasn't just a sign of aging. It was a sign of her power fading. For Sisi, losing her beauty meant losing everything. It meant losing her freedom, her travels, her independence. It meant being trapped in the Hofburg again, forever. And so she embarked on a new, all-consuming project. If beauty was her only true and lasting weapon, she would turn its preservation into her life's work. She would not simply be a beautiful woman. She would become a living work of art, a flawless icon, a construct so perfect and disciplined that time itself could not dare to touch it. Her body was now her empire, and she would rule it with an iron fist. And the crown jewel of this new empire, the thing that became the center of her entire existence, was her hair. It was her most famous feature, a thick, chestnut-brown mane that reached all the way to the floor. It was so heavy that she often complained of headaches, and she would have to sit for hours with her hair tied up to ribbons on the ceiling just to relieve the pressure on her neck. In a very real way, her hair had become her crown, and she guarded it with a terrifying devotion. The care of this hair was not a simple task. It was a day-long religious ceremony that took place every 3 weeks, presided over by her personal hairdresser, Fanny Pfeifferlich. The washing itself took hours, using a special mixture of dozens of eggs and French cognac. Afterwards, Cece would put on a waterproof gown and pace back and forth for the rest of the day while Fanny followed behind, holding the hair out and drying it with a large fan. The entire day was a write-off, dedicated solely to this ritual. But the most terrifying part of the ritual came after. Once the hair was dry, Fanny would have to carefully comb it out. And Cece would watch, hawk-eyed, as every single strand that fell out was collected and presented to her on a silver tray. It was a tyranny. For the hairdresser, it must have been an experience of pure terror. If Cece saw a single hair on that tray that Fanny hadn't managed to secretly hide in her apron pocket, her rage was immediate. Fanny would be slapped or dismissed from her presence for the rest of the day. For us, it sounds like the behavior of a monster. But for Cece, it's heartbreakingly easy to understand. Each fallen hair wasn't just a hair. It was a visible, tangible sign of decay. It was a crack in her armor, a reminder that the one thing that gave her power, her beauty, was mortal and could be lost. But her obsession didn't stop with her hair. If her hair was the crown of her empire, her figure was its fortress, and she defended it with a discipline that bordered on self-punishment. The most famous and most shocking aspect of this was her waist. Cece was determined to maintain the impossibly tiny 19-inch waist of her youth, well into her middle age. To achieve this, she subjected herself to a daily ritual of being sewn into tightly laced leather corsets. It must have been agonizing, restricting her breathing and making it difficult to even sit down. But for Cece, this physical constriction was a symbol of her control. To maintain this impossible figure, her diet became just as extreme. Food was no longer a source of pleasure or nourishment. It was the enemy. She lived for long stretches on nothing but thin broth, milk, and oranges. And then there was the most infamous part of her diet, raw meat juice. She would have raw beefsteaks pressed, and she would drink the bloody liquid that was extracted. It's a horrifying image, but for Cece, it was a way to get the bare minimum of sustenance without the risk of solid food and potential weight gain. And then there was the exercise. Cece became a compulsive walker and hiker. She would embark on furious, fast-paced walks that lasted for hours, often covering dozens of miles in a single day. She would completely exhaust her ladies-in-waiting, who were often forced to drop out, unable to keep up with the Empress's relentless pace. This wasn't a leisurely stroll in the park. It was a frantic, desperate attempt to burn every possible calorie, to punish her body into submission. The corset, the diet, the exercise, it was all part of a single, all-consuming system. It was a tyranny of beauty she had imposed on herself, a way to fight back against the one thing she couldn't control: time. It was a prison she had built for herself, and she was both the guard and the sole inmate. But the frantic walking and the starvation diets were not enough. The prison of her own body, as tightly controlled as it was, still contained a mind that was in agony. And so, Sisi turned to the one thing that had always brought her a sense of freedom, the one true passion of her youth: horses. But this was not the joyful, free-spirited riding of her childhood in Bavaria. This was something much, much darker. She threw herself into the most dangerous and demanding equestrian sport in the world: English and Irish fox hunting. She spent vast amounts of money building stables in England and Ireland, and for months at a time, she would disappear into this world. She became, by all accounts, one of the most skilled and fearless horsewomen in all of Europe. But her reputation wasn't just for skill. It was for a terrifying, almost inhuman recklessness. This wasn't a sport for her. It was a flirtation with death. She would take jumps that seasoned professional huntsmen refused. She would gallop at breakneck speeds over treacherous terrain, her face blank, as if she were chasing not a fox, but oblivion itself. Her entourage watched in horror, certain that one day they would see her killed before their very eyes. For Sisi, it seems this was the entire point. She was so trapped in her own life, so convinced of her own misery, that a violent end in the middle of a hunt must have felt like a release. She reportedly told a friend that she hoped for a fall that would finally break her neck, ending her suffering in one swift, decisive moment. For me, this is one of the most heartbreaking parts of her story. She couldn't find a way to live, so she was actively searching for a way to die that was as wild and free as she had once been. The one thing that had once given her life meaning was now her chosen method of escape. And all of this, the endless travels, the starvation, the reckless hunts, meant that Sisi was almost never in Vienna. She was a ghost in her own palace, a fleeting presence in her own family's life, and her husband, the Emperor Franz Joseph, was left utterly alone. He was a man of routine and duty, and he still loved his beautiful wandering wife, but their marriage had become a union of profound distance. He would write her letters, pleading for her to come home, but he was writing to a woman who was no longer there. And Sisi, for all her self-absorption, was not blind to this. She knew her husband was lonely, and she must have felt a strange and complicated kind of guilt. She knew she was incapable of being the warm, present companion he needed. The very thought of returning to the court and its duties filled her with dread. But she still cared for him in her own way. So, in one of the most bizarre and telling episodes of their marriage, Sisi decided to solve the problem herself. If she could not play the part of the loving, attentive wife, she would cast someone who could. Her chosen actress for this role was a woman named Katharina Schratt, a popular and beloved star of the Vienna stage. Katharina was everything Sisi was not: warm, cheerful, uncomplicated, and happy to be in Vienna. She was a comfortable, grounding presence. Sisi didn't just tolerate the idea of her husband finding companionship, she actively engineered it. She invited Katharina to the palace, she encouraged Franz Joseph to attend her performances, and she made it clear that this new friendship had her blessing. For me, it's a heartbreakingly pragmatic solution. Sisi was essentially saying, I cannot make you happy, but I can find someone who will. It was an arrangement that would last for the rest of their lives. Katharina became the Emperor's close friend, his confidant, his dear friend. She provided the warmth and companionship that Sisi could not, easing Franz Joseph's loneliness and, in a way, easing Sisi's guilt. She had hired her own replacement. While Sisi was building this strange, detached life for herself, the son she had been forced to abandon was growing up, and Crown Prince Rudolf was, in almost every way, his mother's child. He was intelligent, sensitive, and cursed with a liberal, modern mind in a court that was stuck in the past. He clashed constantly with his conservative father, and he was trapped in a deeply unhappy arranged marriage. Like Sisi, he felt like a prisoner in a golden cage, and he descended into a life of heavy drinking and deep depression. And then, on January 30th, 1889, the carefully constructed worlds of both Sisi and the Empire came crashing down. A message arrived from the Imperial Hunting Lodge at Meierling, a small estate in the Vienna woods. There had been an incident. The Crown Prince was dead. At first, the court tried to control the story, claiming he had died of a heart attack, but the truth was far too gruesome to hide for long. In his bedroom, officials had found the bodies of the 30-year-old Rudolf and his 17-year-old mistress, Baroness Mary Wetzera. He had shot her, and then, hours later, he had shot himself. It was a murder-suicide. The catastrophe was absolute. For Franz Joseph, it was the collapse of his dynasty. The future of the empire was gone. But for Sisi, it was a personal horror that is almost impossible to comprehend. The guilt she had carried over the death of her first daughter, Sophie, must have felt like nothing compared to this. She had fought for Rudolf as a boy, lost him to a brutal system, and then abandoned him to a life of misery while she chased her own freedom. In her mind, she had not been there to save him. For a woman who already believed she was a curse on the people she loved, this was the final damning proof. The news shattered her. The vibrant, defiant girl was gone. The wandering Empress was gone. All that was left was a mother who had now lost 2 of her children. From this moment on, Sisi would wear nothing but black. The mourning would never end because the guilt would never end. The future of the dynasty was dead, and for Sisi, so was any last hope of finding peace in this life. The death of her son was not a wound that could ever heal. It was a final, complete shattering. And in the wake of Meierling, Sisi began the slow, deliberate process of erasing the woman she had once been. The first thing to go was the colour. She gave away her entire wardrobe of magnificent gowns, the clothes that had once defined her as Europe's most beautiful empress. She also gave away her legendary collection of jewels. All of it was cast aside. From that moment on, her only uniform was black. Black dresses, black gloves, black veils. It was a public declaration that her life as a vibrant living woman was over. She was now in permanent, unending mourning, not just for her son, but for her own life, for the hope that had died with him. But the transformation went deeper than just her clothes. The woman who had once built an empire on her own beauty now refused to be seen at all. She began to carry a large black leather fan and a dark parasol with her at all times. If she was in public, one or the other would be held up, completely obscuring her face from view. The cult of beauty was over. For Sisi, it must have felt like her beauty had been a curse. It had trapped her in a marriage. It had made her a target of the court. And it had ultimately failed to bring her any real happiness or save her son. Now, it was a source of shame. She was hiding her face, etched with the grief of a mother who had lost 2 children. But she was also hiding the fact that she was aging. The project that had consumed her for decades was now abandoned. The vibrant girl from Posse was gone. The wandering empress was gone. The icon of beauty was gone. All that remained was the figure from the police report in Geneva. A ghost, dressed in black, hiding her face from a world that had taken everything from her. And so, in September of 1898, the wandering empress arrived in Geneva, Switzerland. She was 60 years old, but her restless travels had not slowed. If anything, they had become more frantic, as if she were trying to outrun the ghosts that followed her everywhere she went. She checked into her hotel, not as the Empress of Austria, but under one of her regular travelling pseudonyms, the Countess of Hohenems. This was her life now, a constant, desperate search for anonymity. But in the politically charged atmosphere of the late 19th century, true anonymity for a royal was impossible. The local police were well aware of who the Countess really was, and they were nervous. Europe was rife with anarchist activity, and a prominent royal, even one in hiding, was a tempting target. They approached Sisi's entourage and warned them of the potential danger, strongly advising that she accept a police escort for her own protection. Sisi's response was swift and absolute. She refused. She dismissed the warnings with an air of irritation, as if the police were just another annoyance, another group of people trying to control her movements. For the officers, it must have seemed like pure arrogance, the act of a monarch who believed she was above such mortal threats. But for Sisi, it was something much, much deeper. It was a profound and unshakable fatalism. After the death of Rudolf, what was there left to be afraid of? She had already endured the worst thing that life could possibly throw at her. The threat of some unknown assassin's blade must have seemed trivial in comparison. And for a woman who had spent her entire adult life fighting against being watched, against being controlled, the idea of a police escort was just another cage. She had finally achieved a sliver of freedom in her anonymity, and she would not surrender it. She would rather walk into danger as a free woman than be protected as a prisoner. She was done running from fate. For me, this is the most telling moment of her final days. She wasn't just ignoring the danger, she was inviting it in. It was a passive death wish, the final quiet act of a woman who had been recklessly chasing death on the hunting fields for years. She had given up, and so she walked through the streets of Geneva, a ghost in black, deliberately and completely unprotected. And so, on the morning of September 10th, 1898, Sisi and her lady-in-waiting left their hotel to walk along the promenade of Lake Geneva. They were heading to catch the steamship that would take them to their next destination. As always, Sisi was dressed in black, her face shielded by her fan and parasol. She was just another anonymous woman taking a stroll. But on that same morning, another person was walking through the streets of Geneva, filled with a furious and desperate sense of purpose. His name was Luigi Lucchesi. He was a 25-year-old Italian anarchist, a man who had grown up in poverty and who had come to despise the aristocracy. He had come to Geneva with a singular violent goal, to make a name for himself by assassinating a royal. His original target had been the Prince of Orleans, the claimant to the French throne. But just days before, the prince had changed his travel plans and left the city. Lucchesi was furious. He had told his anarchist comrades that he would kill someone, and he was determined to follow through. He famously declared, "I would kill any great personage. It would not matter who, so long as he was well known." It's a chilling twist of fate. Lucchesi was a man with a weapon, desperate for any royal target. And then he happened to pick up a local newspaper. An article mentioned that the mysterious Countess of Hohenems, currently staying in Geneva, was in fact the Empress of Austria. He had found his sovereign. As Sisi and her companion walked towards the pier, Lucchesi saw them. He ran towards the two women. To the few people watching, it probably looked like he just tripped, stumbling clumsily into the Empress. He struck her in the chest, and she fell to the ground. Her lady-in-waiting cried out, and passers-by helped the 60-year-old woman back to her feet. Sisi herself seemed more annoyed than hurt. She brushed herself off, convinced the man had simply been trying to steal her watch. She felt a little dizzy, but she insisted on continuing to the boat. But he hadn't just stumbled. On the gangplank of the steamship, Sisi suddenly collapsed. Her companion, believing she had just fainted from the shock, began to unlace her tight corset to help her breathe. And that's when she saw it. A small, dark stain on the Empress's chemise, right over her heart. And beneath it, a tiny triangular wound, so small it was almost invisible. The weapon, a sharpened needle file that Lucchesi had hidden in a bouquet of flowers, had done its work with lethal precision. And yet, for all her efforts to disappear, for all the black veils and hidden faces, the image of Sisi that endures is not the ghost in Geneva, it's the fairy tale. It's the young, impossibly beautiful Empress captured in a single iconic painting. I'm talking, of course, about the famous portrait by Franz Xaver Winterhalter, painted in 1865, showing Sisi with the diamond stars in her hair. When you look at it, you can see why it became her legend. She seems to float in a cloud of white tulle. Her skin is flawless, her expression is serene, and her famous floor-length hair is woven into an intricate crown, studded with those glittering diamond stars. Her waist is impossibly small. This is not a real woman. This is an ethereal being, a goddess of beauty. This is the image that launched 1,000 postcards and inspired the Romy Schneider movies. It is the triumph of the cult of beauty she had built around herself. But when we remember the story we've just told, the portrait starts to look very different. The year is 1865. This is not the happy young girl from Posse. This is a woman who has already lost 1 child to death and 2 more to her mother-in-law. This is a woman who has already begun using illness as her only means of escape. This is a woman who is already deeply, profoundly unhappy. And suddenly, the portrait becomes a document of her suffering. That impossibly tiny waist isn't a sign of delicate beauty. It's the result of starvation diets and agonizingly tight corsets. The flawless skin was maintained with bizarre and punishing treatments, like sleeping in a mask lined with raw veal. The serene expression is just that, a mask, hiding the anxiety and depression that were her constant companions. For me, this is the central question of Cece's life, captured on one canvas. Is this portrait her glory or her prison? Is it the ultimate symbol of the empire of beauty she ruled with an iron fist? Or is it just the most beautiful cage she ever inhabited? The diamond stars in her hair are breathtaking, but they are also cold and hard and heavy. In the end, I think it's both. The portrait is a lie, but it's a lie she desperately wanted to believe in, a perfect image she constructed to hide the broken woman behind it. It is the ultimate symbol of her life, a flawless, beautiful surface hiding a world of unimaginable pain. It is her masterpiece and her cage. On the deck of the steamship, as her lady-in-waiting frantically unlaced the corset, the truth of the attack became horrifyingly clear. The tiny wound, almost invisible, had been perfectly placed. The sharpened file had pierced her heart. Cece, the Empress of Austria and Queen of Hungary, reportedly opened her eyes one last time, looked at her companion with an expression of surprise, and then died. Her last words, spoken just before she collapsed, were, "What has happened to me?" It's a strange and tragic irony. A woman who had spent decades chasing a dramatic, reckless death on the hunting fields died from a wound so small she didn't even notice it at first. A woman who had built an empire on her own beauty died anonymously, mistaken for a common woman who had simply fainted. The Empress who had fought her entire life for freedom and privacy was killed by a man who didn't even know who she was until he read it in a newspaper, a man who just wanted to kill someone famous. Luigi Lucchini was caught and proudly confessed to his crime, declaring, "I regret nothing." He would spend the rest of his life in prison, eventually taking his own life. And so, the wandering Empress's journey was finally over. The restless spirit who could never find a home, who fled from palace to palace, from country to country, had finally found her rest. The story that began with a vibrant, free-spirited girl in the forests of Bavaria had ended here, on the deck of a pleasure boat in Geneva. The ghost in black from the police report, the woman hiding her face from the world, was no longer a mystery. We have seen how the weight of a crown, the cruelty of a court, and the unbearable grief of a mother can hollow a person out, leaving nothing but a shell. But the strangest thing of all, the final, most enduring mystery of Cece's life, is that this tragic figure is not the one we remember. The woman who died alone, emaciated and hidden behind a black fan, has been almost completely erased from our collective memory. In her place, we have the fairy tale. We have the Romy Schneider movies, the beautiful young Empress with the diamond stars in her hair, falling in love with her handsome emperor. We have the triumph, not the tragedy. For me, this is the ultimate proof of the power of the myth she created. She built an empire of beauty so potent that it has outlived the sad reality of her life. We have chosen to remember the flawless portrait, not the broken woman behind it. Perhaps it's because the reality of her suffering is just too much to bear. It's easier to believe in the fairy tale. And so, Sisi, in the end, got her wish. She escaped. She escaped the court, she escaped her duties, and in the end, she even escaped her own tragic story, leaving behind only the beautiful, impossible, and immortal legend she had so carefully constructed.